The 8th of July, 1944, Normandy, France. Cold morning mist clings to the hedgerows as a low rumble vibrates through the damp earth. Inside a steel hull barely large enough for 5 men, the air smells of oil sweat and burned cordite. A commander's voice cuts through the headset, calm but urgent. Tracks grind slowly in the mud. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind thick hedges and shattered farm walls, another tank waits. The gunner wipes condensation from a sight glass. The loader braces his boots against the floor plates as the vehicle lurches forward. Outside, artillery echoes across the countryside like distant thunder. Then the commander whispers one word: stop. The engine drops to idle. Silence falls inside the tank except for the ticking of hot metal. The driver grips the levers. The gun barrel inches toward a narrow opening in the hedge, and suddenly the hedgerow erupts with fire. A German Panther tank bursts from concealment, its long 75mm gun already turning toward them. But the American crew had expected exactly that. The Sherman reverses, sharply sliding back behind the hedgerow just as the Panther fires. The shell tears through empty air where the Sherman had been seconds earlier. The Panther crew hesitates for a moment, confused. That moment of hesitation can decide everything. Tank warfare in the Second World War is often imagined as brute force. Massive armored machines smashing into each other across open fields. Steel against steel. Gun against gun, but the truth is very different. Victory inside a tank rarely belongs to the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It belongs to the crew that can think faster, because inside those cramped vehicles survival depends on something more powerful than steel. Tactics, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Eastern Europe and the tangled hedgerows of Normandy. Tank crews constantly invent ways to outthink their enemies. Crews develop tricks, maneuvers, and battlefield instincts that turn vulnerable machines into deadly hunters. A tank is not just a weapon, it is a moving team. 5 men. Each with a role. Each dependent on the others. The commander scans the battlefield through periscopes, trying to read terrain and enemy movement before the enemy can do the same. The gunner focuses on one task: finding and destroying targets before they destroy him. The loader works in relentless rhythm, lifting heavy shells again and again in suffocating heat. The driver maneuvers 30 tons of steel through mud, shell holes, forests, and fire. The bow gunner watches blind spots where danger often appears without. Warning: if even one of them hesitates, the tank can become a burning coffin. Yet despite these risks, tank crews quickly discover something remarkable. Armor is only part of the equation. Position matters more, timing matters more, and sometimes deception matters most of all. Early in the war, German armored units demonstrate how powerful clever tactics can be. During the lightning campaigns in Poland and France, German panzer commanders rely on coordination and speed rather than raw armor strength. They avoid static duels whenever possible. Instead, tanks maneuver aggressively, striking flanks, isolating enemies, and using terrain as natural cover. German commanders often turn the landscape itself into a weapon. A hill can hide an entire armored platoon. A forest can mask movement. A narrow village street can become a deadly ambush corridor. Meanwhile, Allied tank crews learn these lessons the hard way. In North Africa, British crews operating Crusader and Valentine tanks quickly realize the desert offers almost no protection. Visibility stretches for miles. Any tank silhouetted on the horizon can be targeted long before it reaches firing range. So British crews adopt a simple but effective tactic. They begin positioning their tanks behind small ridges and sand dunes, exposing only the turret above the crest. This technique later becomes widely known as hull-down positioning, and it makes the tank much harder to destroy. Only the turret remains visible. The rest of the vehicle stays hidden behind terrain. It is simple, but it works, and once crews master it, tank battles begin to change. Across the battlefield, armored vehicles start behaving less like blunt weapons and more like predators stalking prey. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the scale of armored warfare becomes enormous. Soviet and German tanks clash in battles involving hundreds, sometimes thousands of vehicles. Yet even their clever individual crews can change the outcome of an engagement. Some Soviet tank commanders deliberately use smoke, dust, and terrain to disguise their movements before closing the distance for a sudden strike. Others wait patiently along forest edges or behind ridgelines, letting enemy armor drive directly into carefully prepared kill zones. Inside those tanks, the crews hear everything: the whine of the engine, the grinding of gears, the distant boom of artillery. Sometimes even the sound of enemy engines approaching. In those moments, training matters. But instinct matters even more. because when two tanks finally see each other across a battlefield, the fight can be over in seconds. And the difference between life and death might come down to a single maneuver, a sudden turn, a faster reload, or a commander who understands something the enemy does not. One of the most famous examples appears. During the chaotic battles in Normandy in the summer of 1944, the terrain there is unlike anything tank crews have faced before. The countryside is divided by thick hedgerows, ancient earth embankments covered in tangled vegetation. Some rise nearly 10 feet high. For tank crews, they are both shield and trap. Visibility drops to almost nothing. Ambushes become terrifyingly common. German Panther and Tiger tanks use the hedgerows to conceal themselves until Allied armor drives dangerously close. Then they fire from hidden positions at short range, but Allied crews adapt quickly. American tankers begin modifying their Shermans with welded steel prongs, improvised devices built from salvaged German beach obstacles. These metal prongs allow tanks to punch directly through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. Suddenly, Shermans can burst through dense barriers without exposing their vulnerable underside. The battlefield changes again, and with it come new tactics. Sherman crews begin coordinating in small groups, one tank drawing enemy attention while another moves around the flank toward the hidden position. Sometimes the first tank deliberately exposes itself, a dangerous gamble. But if the enemy fires and reveals its position, the second tank strikes immediately. The tactic demands incredible nerve. Because the crew acting as bait understands one thing: if the enemy gunner reacts quickly enough, there will be no second chance. Yet time after time, crews trust each other enough to try. Because clever tactics can overcome even the most dangerous machines. But nowhere will these ideas be pushed further than in the brutal armored battles that follow. Battles where individual crews begin inventing tricks that seem almost unbelievable: decoys, fake retreats, ambushes using destroyed tanks as cover, and in one remarkable case, a tank crew will drive directly toward a far more powerful enemy vehicle, not to attack, but to deceive it. And what happens next will become one of the most ingenious moments in tank warfare history. The 14th of June, 1944, Normandy, France. The engine vibrates beneath the steel floor plates as the Sherman inches forward through the grey morning fog. Moisture drips from the hedgerow leaves above the turret. Inside the tank, the crew sits in tense silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the clink of a shell sliding into the loader's hands. Somewhere ahead, a German Panther is waiting. The American commander presses his headset tighter against his ears. Through the periscope, he sees almost nothing except narrow farm lanes and towering hedgerows, perfect ambush terrain. The Panther is one of the most dangerous tanks in the war. Its long 75mm gun can destroy a Sherman from well over 1,000 meters. Its thick sloped armor can deflect many incoming rounds. In a straight fight, the Panther usually has the advantage. So experienced Sherman crews learn something very quickly. Do not fight a Panther on its terms. Instead, they rely on movement, teamwork, and deception. During the summer battles in Normandy, American tankers begin refining a tactic that will appear again and again in combat reports. Instead of advancing directly down narrow lanes where German tanks expect them, they maneuver along parallel hedgerows, searching for small openings in the thick earth walls. The hedgerows hide everything: engines, tracks, entire tanks. A Sherman can sit only a few meters away and remain completely invisible. Crews begin using this terrain like chess players using pieces on a board. One Sherman deliberately moves into a visible position, drawing attention. The German crew spots the movement and prepares to fire. But at that exact moment, a second Sherman bursts through a hedgerow to the side, firing into the weaker flank armor of the Panther. German tank armor is strongest at the front. The sides are far more vulnerable, and the few seconds it takes for a Panther turret to rotate can mean survival for the Sherman crew. This tactic appears in multiple American armored reports during the Normandy campaign. Tank platoons learn to hunt as teams rather than individual vehicles. 2 Tanks distract. 1 Tank kills. Sometimes the maneuver works perfectly, sometimes it ends in flames, because every German crew is also adapting. Meanwhile, another remarkable tactic develops hundreds of kilometers away on the Eastern Front. Soviet tank crews operating the famous T-34 discover something unusual about their machines. The tank is not always superior in armor or gunpowder compared with later German tanks like the Tiger and Panther, but the T-34 has one enormous advantage: mobility. Its wide tracks allow it to move across mud, snow, and rough ground where heavier German tanks struggle. Soviet commanders begin using that advantage aggressively. Instead of engaging German tanks at long range where German guns are most effective, Soviet crews often close the distance rapidly, sometimes charging forward at full speed. At close range, the battlefield becomes chaotic. Dust, smoke, and engine noise fill the air. Visibility collapses. In those conditions, the superior optics and long-range accuracy of German tanks become far less useful. Now the fight depends on speed and reaction. Soviet crews sometimes attempt a maneuver that German tankers describe with alarm in after-action reports. They circle. A fast-moving T-34 swings around a heavier German tank, trying to stay outside the slow-turning arc of the turret. If successful, the Soviet tank can reach the rear armor, which is usually the weakest part of the vehicle. Rear armor on many tanks is designed mainly to protect the engine, not withstand direct attack. But attempting this maneuver is incredibly dangerous. One accurate shot from the German gun can end the fight instantly. Tank battles become deadly contests of reflexes and nerve. Another clever tactic appears in the deserts of North Africa earlier in the war. British and German crews both discover how powerful something very simple can be. Dust. In the dry desert terrain, a moving tank throws up enormous clouds of dust visible from kilometers away. This usually reveals a tank's position to the enemy. But some crews begin using dust deliberately. A small group of tanks drives in circles behind a ridge, kicking up thick clouds that look like a much larger armored formation. Enemy observers watching through binoculars see what appears to be an entire armored unit approaching. Sometimes they redeploy forces to respond to the threat, sometimes they retreat entirely, all because of a carefully created illusion. The battlefield becomes a place where perception can be as important as firepower. Even damaged tanks sometimes become tools in these deceptions. Several documented engagement crews position knocked out vehicles to conceal their own tanks behind the wreckage. From a distance, the enemy believes the area contains only destroyed machines. Then suddenly a hidden gun fires. Tank crews constantly search for ways to survive longer than the enemy expects, and survival inside a tank is never guaranteed. The interior temperature can rise above 40 degrees Celsius during combat. The roar of the engine and gunfire creates constant deafening noise. The smell of fuel, oil, and hot metal fills the cramped space. But the most terrifying danger is fire. When a tank is penetrated, the result can be catastrophic. Ammunition ignites. Fuel burns. Flames fill the interior within seconds. Veteran tankers understand this risk every time they climb inside their vehicle. That knowledge shapes how they fight. Caution becomes instinct. Position becomes everything. And sometimes crews rely on bold ideas that seem almost reckless. One famous example occurs during the Battle of Villers-Bocage in June 1944, when British forces encounter the German heavy tank commander Michael Wittmann. His Tiger tank destroys multiple British vehicles in rapid succession using surprise and aggressive maneuvering through the narrow streets. But British crews observing the attack later report something equally important. Wittmann moves constantly. He fires, then shifts position, immediately preventing enemy tanks from targeting him easily. Shoot and move, another simple tactic, yet extremely effective. The lesson spreads quickly among Allied tank units: never stay still after firing, because the enemy is already aiming back. Meanwhile, American armored instructors back in training bases in Britain and the United States begin studying combat reports carefully. They notice a pattern. Tank crews that survive multiple battles almost always display the same behaviors. They coordinate closely with infantry. They avoid exposed terrain. They attack from unexpected directions, and above all, they keep moving. Movement confuses enemy gunners. Movement creates opportunities. Movement keeps a tank alive. But perhaps the most daring tactic reported during the war involves something almost unbelievable. In several encounters, American crews deliberately pretend to retreat. The Sherman reverses, quickly disappearing behind cover. Enemy tanks assume the fight is over. They advance forward to pursue, and in doing so, they unknowingly expose their vulnerable side armor to another hidden tank waiting nearby. It is a dangerous trick. Timing must be perfect. Communication between crews must be flawless, but if the enemy suspects the trap even for a moment, the result can be disaster. Yet when the tactic works, the effect is devastating. A powerful enemy tank suddenly becomes the target, and in the chaos of armored warfare, even the strongest machines can be destroyed by clever planning. But one particular encounter later in the war will push the idea of deception further than anyone expects. A single American tank crew will face an enemy vehicle far more powerful than their own. Their gun will struggle to penetrate its armor. their chances will seem almost hopeless. So, instead of relying on firepower, they will attempt something far riskier. They will try to outthink the enemy crew completely, and the move they choose will leave both sides staring at each other in disbelief for a split second before the battlefield erupts again. The 12th of August, 1944 06A, Normandy, France. Morning light barely penetrates the thick mist hanging over the hedgerows. The ground is churned mud, torn apart by dozens of tank tracks and the scattered debris of battle. Inside the Sherman, the crew sits tensely. The driver feels every bump and rut beneath his hands. The commander leans over the periscope, scanning, calculating. Somewhere ahead, obscured by a twisted wall of hedgerows and fallen timber, a Tiger waits. Its massive 88mm gun gleams faintly in the weak sunlight. The crew knows their Sherman cannot survive a frontal engagement. Every second counts. The gunner grips his sighting handles, listening to the whine of the engine and the distant rattle of artillery. The loader has rounds ready, sweat dripping down his temple. Outside, the faint smell of burning oil drifts on the wind. The Sherman advances slowly along a narrow lane, deliberately exposing itself. The Tiger's turret swings, following the movement. Time stretches. The Sherman halts briefly, then reverses behind the hedgerow, disappearing from view, and then the maneuver begins. Another Sherman, hidden just beyond the first, swings around the Tiger's flank. The exposed Tiger commander hesitates, trying to identify the target. Seconds are critical. The hidden Sherman fires into the weaker side armor. The shell strikes with a deafening impact, tearing through the metal. The Tiger fires in response, but the angle is wrong. The shot deflects harmlessly into the mud. The clever coordination of small units has turned the tables. The crew inside the Sherman feels a brief surge of adrenaline, but there is no time to celebrate. Another Panther may be nearby. Another ambush could be waiting. This is the essence of armored warfare by 1944. Brute force alone cannot win. Survival depends on anticipation, teamwork, and a willingness to gamble against superior firepower. Every maneuver is a calculation. Every hesitation could be fatal. The Normandy hedgerows demanded ingenuity. Crews welded improvised hedgerow cutters onto their tanks, slicing through dense earth embankments without exposing vulnerable underbellies. Smoke screens became commonplace, concealing movements and creating confusion. Crews learned to hug the terrain, using every ridge, ditch, and farm wall as protection while planning attacks from unexpected angles. Soviet tankers on the Eastern Front applied similar lessons on a much larger scale. Fast-moving T-34s darted through forested terrain, circling heavier German tanks to target their weaker rear armor. In multiple documented engagements, crews coordinated like dancers, weaving between trees and shell craters, striking with devastating precision. The psychological effect on German crews was profound. A tank that seemed to vanish and reappear from nowhere could demoralize even the most disciplined soldiers. Tank battles became a blend of engineering, intuition, and nerves. The roar of engines, the smoke, the shouts of men, the smell of burning fuel, and the sudden flashes of enemy fire created a sensory overload. Crews had to maintain focus, communicate flawlessly, and anticipate enemy actions instinctively. One misstep could ignite the ammunition inside, turning a machine into a fiery tomb. By late summer 1944, clever tank tactics had evolved into an art form. Decoys, feigned retreats, and coordinated ambushes became standard practice. Veteran crews relied less on the size or armor of their tanks and more on creativity and timing. A Sherman might be smaller and weaker than a Tiger, but with strategy it could dominate. One documented engagement in the hedgerows perfectly illustrates this. An American Sherman platoon encountered a Tiger well dug in behind a collapsed farmhouse. Direct engagement would have been suicide. Instead, the lead Sherman pretended to advance recklessly, drawing fire. The Tiger opened its turret toward the bait, revealing its side. Hidden Shermans moved simultaneously, firing into the flank. Within minutes, the Tiger was immobilized. It was a high-risk tactic requiring precision, nerves, and trust among the crew. The reward was life or death. Tank warfare in the Second World War was never purely mechanical. It was human ingenuity expressed through steel and fire. Every crew developed small tricks, learned from every engagement, and passed knowledge forward. Maps were studied obsessively, terrain memorized, and enemy habits anticipated. Soldiers learned that anticipating the enemy was more important than raw firepower. By the end of the war, these lessons would influence armored doctrine for decades. Modern tank tactics still draw on the principles developed under fire in North Africa, Normandy, and Eastern Europe. Positioning, mobility, teamwork, and deception. Yet as we reflect, there is a haunting truth. Every clever tactic, every ingenious maneuver, existed because men risked their lives in the belly of these machines. They faced fire, fear, and death, relying on instinct, trust, and courage. The roar of engines and distant gunfire fades now into history. The mud of Normandy hedgerows, the dust of the Russian steppes, and the scorching sands of North Africa remain silent witnesses. But the lessons of those tank crews endure. They remind us that in the chaos of war, human intellect and courage can turn even the most vulnerable machine into a force to be reckoned with, and sometimes, surviving depends not on being the strongest, but on being the smartest, fastest, and most fearless. What would happen if those crews had hesitated for even a second? History remembers the winners. But the stories of those who survived by wit and courage often reveal more than any tally of tanks destroyed ever could.